Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Today's talk is a very preliminary work. Valentina, myself, and Chiara Orsini, and Johan Kohler. We are a team working on this project, but everything was quite timed in real time, and we didn't get much time to wrap up all the results that we have. So I just should make the disclaimer that you're going to see the preliminary results for the first time. So I would like to hear feedback at every stage about this project. And also, the project lead in this work is actually Valentina, and who's unfortunately COVID positive and sitting there on the corner. So Valentina, wave hands. She's a fourth year PhD student, and then this is she's the engine behind the entire project. But I'm presenting on behalf of her. It's going to be too complicated to do both on Zoom or anything. Next slide, please. So we want to start with acknowledgements because I think it's important to give this acknowledgement and preamble. We first want to say all the SP401 students who participated in our work in the last 2 years cohorts. And the ones that are in the room, we particularly say thank you on their behalf, but also the previous cohorts. These are the two cohorts that they were struck by the COVID-19. And so we get informed consent of all participants for the survey. And we have done the ethical approval. We want to say thank you for Berkay approving our ethics forms for this project, and also David Lewis, who helped us with the ethics forms previously. And we did register our data management plan and anonymize all the data. So we worked in an entirely anonymized setting. And we also want to say thank you to Fergus Theory in RDS. This project is actually a baby of a much larger project we got the Eden grant for. And we have collected the data for the entire LSE, all the master's program for the last 4 years. But today we're going to be only talking about the SP401 section, and we are going to be only talking about this particular project. And this is the first time we're presenting our results, and so any comments are welcome.
Berkay, yeah. In the Zoom, we're stuck at the title slide.
Oh, bummer. So,
yes, now we see the.
Okay. So can you go to the next slide, please? So the motivational argument, the background of this is basically we wanted to do something in this project with the SP401 students, but our idea is basically coming from the much broader literature where increasing participation of women in the higher education as well as increasing immigrants in the labor market have brought more forefront the discussions of diversity and inclusion in the teamwork and group settings, both in educational institutions, but a lot of studies are also in the workplaces as well. And then we have seen increasing participation of international students and as well as women exceeding in higher education men in most advanced economies, made a lot of discussions also in whether the educational outcomes are affected by the compositional factors that are in the classroom, such as gender, ethnicity, and linguistic issues, more so in recent literature. So we wanted to hopefully write an academic paper that not only, so our aim was not only just inform ourselves as the department about how we're doing at the SP401. In fact, our main goal is not to do that because we don't have the design to say whether SP401 is working or the group studies are working. We have the design to answer our research question, which is basically group composition. Does it really have any effect on educational outcomes of people? I'm sorry, I'm going to take this mask off. Getting windy. So this is a study that contributes to literature where there is very few studies actually analyzed quantitatively whether the diversity in educational settings and whether they inform the educational outcomes. And existing literature, there are only a handful of studies that we noticed that does this work quantitatively. By Stephen Metchen and Murphy, they have a paper that only conducted with all undergraduate studies. There's a bunch of papers that are using undergraduate students in the first year undergrads in these experimental settings. And then those studies mostly focus on larger classrooms as unit of analysis to understand how the peer effects work and student classroom compositions work for educational outcomes. And then if a subset of them focuses on women in environments where women are a minority, like STEM education, where male-dominated fields and so on. Where we have a setting, so next slide, please, Maria, where we have a setting that we don't know actually in the literature much about how group composition affects students who are more mature in postgraduate programs and often with work experiences that are more realistic for the external validity for the labor market and workplace settings. And also, we don't have much evidence in small groups and teams which are more similar to the teamwork that we would observe in real life workplace settings. So like addressing these gaps, we felt that matters because feelings of being a member in a minority in a small group might be very different than peer effects that are operating in the undergraduate classrooms that are much larger and being a minority there. And also at more mature ages that might be experienced differently. And like we also thought that the performance in postgraduate education is more directly related to labor market entry, especially in our setting. It's 1-year MSc program where people are going to be heading off to the labor markets, and they already come with labor market experiences. So understanding how team dynamics work is very different than an undergraduate first-year students who haven't really done those experiences. But also, most of these studies have been thinking about women as a minority in male-dominated occupations, that we have a setting that we have actually a female-dominated program and course setting where men are the minority. We also thought that that might be a nice contribution to the literature. If we see this setting is reversed, do we see some of those effects? Yeah, next slide, please. So what we do in this paper is basically take advantage of the changes in the course delivery due to pandemic that we did as a department. And one of the changes was basically we split the seminar groups into smaller seminar groups. Rather than 16, we moved to the 8 and 10. And then we have even created smaller study groups within those seminar groups, especially in the first year. So Valentina and I have reacted very quickly in that setting where we said that this might be an opportunity for us to see that small group peer effect settings when we move to this new environment. Obviously, we have to take into account the very uniqueness of these conditions when we are thinking about our results in terms of validity. So what we have done is we quickly collected a survey data on the students of SP401 at the beginning of the term and at the end of the term about their expectations, their previous studies background, their teamwork experiences.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what.
Sorry? Okay. Sorry, machine. So what we have done is a very minimal intervention to the setting. So like the setting was already imposed by the department, our intervention was very minimal, which we basically allocated the research, like small study groups within the seminar groups by a random allocation, which we think that it's an important feature for our study to argue for causality. But it also makes the case that we didn't actually do a lot of intervention. The setting was already there. We just take advantage of the setting in this study. And then we match these students' background information and the survey results and the exam results to the survey questions. So we constructed this database and that we also gathered from the application files from the RDS. And we focus in this paper for this talk 2 dimensions of diversity. We have much more data to focus on different dimensions of diversity. We just didn't have time to actually wrap up the results on those other dimensions. One of them is basically sex. The other one is the native language, whether students are native English speakers versus non-native English speakers in the study groups. So we run regressions to causally estimate the effect of these dimensions on diversity on multiple outcomes. One of them is student expectations of their performance at the end of the course and at the beginning of the course and how these expectations match. I'll talk about these outcomes later. Exam grades. So objective outcomes as opposed to their subjective expectations. And then we also look at the subjective perceptions of their competence and leadership and so on. Yeah. Please, next slide. So we hope to contribute this broader literature that looks at the business teams, political commissions, and mostly on artificial lab settings by giving causal evidence of a real life field experiment that was ongoing at the time. And for the mature student body, that our average age in the sample is about 25. And we, like, as I said, we analyzed like both objective and subjective outcomes. And we hope that we also, for our internal consumption as a department, that we may provide some evidence about differences in terms of students' perceptions about whether their voices is heard within the group dynamics or within the seminar dynamics, whether there are gender differences or like native speaker, non-native speaker differences in average outcomes of the students as well. So we were hoping that if we can wrap up all of our results together with the other project, that we can contribute to LSE's 2030 strategic goals about increasing inclusion and diversity in the study settings. Thank you. So we can move forward. This is the remaining of the talk. I don't want to spend time on that much. Let me first describe the setting. Next slide, please. So the setting is important, how unique it is. And if we especially want to pitch this as an academic paper to an outside journal, we have an elite university setting. It's important to think about our cohort of students that are future policymakers. So what we actually do find in terms of their leadership, self-confidence, and marks and so on, will have some imprint on the, hopefully in the future. And then if anything that we do might have more of an impact, hopefully in the global policymaker body. That's our ambition with the LSE Social Policy Program, that we are actually training the future policymakers in the program. And policy focus is important to highlight because most other settings have been undergraduate core courses in disciplinary environments in the previous literature. So it's undergraduate first year economics students. It's a very different setting than you are thinking about the future policymakers and a postgraduate program. So policy is an important thing that we hope that the dynamics that can have some imprint on the policy debates as well. The discussions are on the policy context. And we do have a competitive student selection, and we do have 2 pandemic cohorts, on average 180, 190 students in our both cohorts. And it's a compulsory course, it's team taught, and lectures were pre-recorded, at least in the first year. There might be some slight changes. Johan, please interject if there are some slight changes there. Were pre-recorded in 1 hour and seminars 4 to 5 minutes in groups of 8 and 10. And then we had the Q&As that are online. And then group work is preset questions that the students had to do and answer. We have some qualitative evidence. The students reported that they have met varying between 20 minutes to an hour to do those group tasks outside organizing by themselves. So that's the group tasks, group work that we talk about in this experimental design. And group work is not assessed. So you may think about it as low stakes for people to participate in this group work. And but then the answers of the questions were then discussed and carried into the seminar settings, right? The seminars were the place where the discussions were taken. Because each seminar included 2 groups where the groups met outside. So we look at both levels of time interactions in our study, both at the smaller group levels and in the seminar levels. And but like we got to remember that in these unique conditions, our seminars are also smaller than usual seminar sizes in these cohorts. And they were hybrid. There were a few seminar groups were all fully online because of the conditions of the pandemic. And then assessments were only based on a timed exam, which was written short questions. I mean, it's important to highlight this because the writing skills was not part of the assessment in the exam formats. Short answers, and sometimes they were extended to a paragraph long, but it's a few sentences, all of them. So we didn't really expect the native speaker versus non-native speaker to play out in the exam because the writing skill is not an important feature. Yeah. So it's quite obvious these things for the department members because either they have taught on this course or, yeah, Eva.
So just a small clarification
Sure.
about the 2021-22 cohort. Did they also do online seminars? Or I thought they did in person?
So we pooled these 2 cohorts. We have only 4 or 5 seminars that they were fully online in the entire seminar pool. And they were most likely in the first cohort. Even in the first cohort, we had in-person hybrid seminars, but it happened in a way that the 1 or 2 seminar groups, I think Thomas, you told 1 or 2 seminar groups that they ended up like people were fully by chance online throughout the term. So I have to say that a minority of seminar groups ended up like being online because those people couldn't arrive here in the first year of cohorts. Yeah.
Great, since we're discussing it, is it by chance that they're online? It's not. Please go.
So good point. We are going to be arguing that the seminar allocation were exogenous to their peer composition. It may not be random, but it was exogenous to the peer composition. So they didn't self-select into seminar or study groups because they prefer to be in a particular peer composition. The allocation was done by the administrative team, and the administrative team's primary concern was basically course clash. And that wasn't particularly like in line with the characteristics. We can talk about how does that pose a threat to the causal identification in the sense that if everyone is like choosing their course selection, looking at their peer, and then they end up like having the same available time slot on the timetable, then you may likely have a like-minded people in the same groups. And then that might be a like threat to the causality. But then within those groups, then we do the further randomization to the study groups. So we can argue that what is it, what causal threat here? So we have done this survey at the week 0-1 as baseline survey, and then the group allocation. And students gone through the 1 to 10 week, they're teaching in their group studies and work. And at the end of the term, we run an end line survey. And then after the term, they've done the exam. Our groups were basically, after random allocation in these, within the seminar groups, were varying in size of 3 to 5 people. Because some seminars were 6, 7 people groups, some seminars were up to 10 people. So it was some reallocation done. And so the group sizes were varying 3 to 5 people. So we generated this randomization within those groups. And then I'll show in the next slide. We do have a random variation in, next slide, please. Oh, sorry for the quality. Sorry, it's not visible here. It was more visible in our computer. It's a data output. So this is a slide that basically shows in each group the proportion of native speakers and proportion of women varies. So we do have sufficient variation across these groups that excluding the person, the ego person, who's our identified person to look at this estimations, that there's sufficient variation in each group that's in terms of gender and native speaker across groups. So for the quality. But then the distribution is some groups have more, some groups have less, but then we have large number of groups that they actually.
Can you just say
So I can't really say, but maybe hopefully Valentina can say. So the first one is the number of
women in the group.
Number of women in the group, and then these are the actual frequencies of a group size that means 3 to 6. And how many women are there across these groups? So these are this is just to illustrate that we didn't have just one type of groups. We did have all sorts of combination of native and women groups across the groups. So it just gives us sufficient variation to exploit in this analysis. Sorry for the quality. Yeah. Can we just move on to the next slide, please? So our survey data basically asks questions about the previous exposure. We had approximately 15, 20 questions, not too many, to similar courses. We asked questions about whether they have been exposed to qualitative methods, quantitative methods, any methods, whether they have done previous master's degree at the postgraduate courses. And then we also asked a bunch of experiences about teamwork, group work, if they have work experience. And we also asked questions about, at the very beginning, before they have taken any courses, what is their expected mark on this course? And we wanted to see how that changes over the term. And their self-perception on leadership roles or the roles in teams. We gave them a bunch of roles and what would be the best fit into your role if you have any team experience. Would you be a facilitator? Would you be a leader? Would you be a peacemaker? So the students answered their self-perceived roles within the team. And the end-line survey asked similar questions for comparison, but it also asked a lot of experience questions. How did you find the group work? What was your experience like? And that gives us some sort of qualitative information to enrich the data. And the administrative data, we have a lot of administrative data actually, but we only used a very select set of them for this paper, which is basically, we have the sex and the native speaker status of the exam marker. And now we have the seminar teacher, sex and native speaker status, and the academic advisor too. And that we can see, because we do have also questions separately in the survey, in the other larger survey, that who did you get most help with your dissertation work and other things and so on. We thought that these are the important sources of receiving some support, that we do have information about that. And then we have information about seminar group sizes, exam marks, countries of origin, and the streams that the students belong. So we control for some of those factors in our estimations. Yeah. So our outcomes, we look at first the exam marks, and then we look at the expected marks. And then based on the expected marks, because we measure them at the beginning of the course, at the end of the course, we have constructed various outcome measures. First, we look at the expected marks per se at the end line, because after they have been exposed to the course, what they expect to get in the mark is an outcome in and of itself is interesting to look at it. But we also wanted to look at how does that differ from the actual mark that they get, how off they are from the actual exam. And we also wanted to look at the differences between the baseline expectations before being exposed to the course and the end line expectation differences to see once they have been exposed to the course, do they have a different assessment of what would they get from the exam mark. These are all slightly different information that brings us in terms of expectations, but I don't know, we can discuss together how useful they are in the sense that one of them, like a lot of students come from very different marking and scaling systems countries. And they're like, before they take the coursework, their expectations might be reflecting on their past experience of how the marking systems work and may not be knowing the UK system, how it works and so on. And the end-line survey might be more reliable in the sense that they may have understanding, their understanding might have improved about how the scales work. But also it might be the experience, like that's an amalgam of experience together with working with other people, with other countries and their relative position, and then adjusting their relative position influenced by the peer effects and the cohorts as well. So what we identify here might be a combination of these factors in those different outcomes. So we have some subjective questions in the end-line surveys. We asked, how was the group experience? And did you think that your voice was heard in group studies and in seminars discussions? So we looked at the people who said, yes, I felt that my voice was heard. And then we have specified the wording of the questions, which I'm going to be showing later. And then we have asked a bunch of questions about what your role was actually in the group. Did you feel that you were the leader or facilitator or whatever the other roles? So it gives us also a comparison between baseline and end-line surveys. So next slide, please. So this is the exam mark summary statistics. We pool both cohorts for these summary statistics. We can discuss about the poolability. And then we can discuss about running these things separately as well later on. We have some attrition issue as well. But this is our distribution of both cohorts. First of all, we have 70 men and 280 women in 2 years. Sorry. Yeah, the labels. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we have the men minority. Okay. And then we have native speakers, almost 50-50. So we can discuss about what the native speaker mean in this case is American, Australian, or English, UK, or so on. We don't look at those differences within the native speakers. So we pull them all self-identified as a native speaker English. But we do have the information about their country of origin. So if you want to go further for analysis to look at these differences, we can. We didn't have a chance to do it. And then we do have non-native speakers too. So what we see here is, on average, in the raw data, we find the non-native speakers performing poorer than the native speakers on exam marks. And you can see them in the quartiles, like there are quite differences. Non-native speakers in the bottom 25 quartile is a pass, while median is a merit. It's the shifted in one band in the other groups. Right, next slide, please. So these are the summary statistics of what student expected in terms of getting in the course before they took the course. So in the baseline survey, the men's expectation were 72 out of 100 scale that they have given, and women's expectation were slightly above the men. And then native speakers have less expectations than non-native speakers. I'll come back to this. Actually, we have a measure, which we will talk about it later, where a distance to English in your home language, which is constructed by Berkay and the co-author and then used in multiple economics papers. So the further away from the English, your language origin, we find that the students overshoot their expected marks. So it's their expectations higher. And in the end-line survey, we have an attrition, as you can see. Men were less likely to fill our end-line survey despite our reminders. And women filled in a higher proportion. We can have comparisons about these attrition as well, so in the data. And what we find here is that expectations were downward adjusted after being exposed to the course content. Yes, Kitty.
But how much information did you, because they're right at the beginning, it just arrived, how much information did you give them before the survey about the marking scheme? I mean, you didn't tell them anything about
nothing.
5% tend to get
Nothing. We haven't given them any.
So you just said on a scale of 1 to 100.
Exactly. We did our idea was with what we didn't want to contemplate anything. We just want to have their expectations at the very beginning, and some of that might be there not understanding the system, obviously.
Yeah, if you come from a system where 90 is.
Exactly. Yeah. So so the mean marks for men and are slightly lower in the end-line survey as well, and native speakers have lowered their expectations, but everybody lowered slightly bit more, but they're still around the distinction high borderline merits range. Next slide, please. So when we ask about how did the group experience work, did you feel that your voice was heard? In the group discussions, and students indicate their level of agreement. Do you agree that your voice was heard on a 0 to 10 scale? So we treat it as cardinal, and then we basically, this is the summary statistics. So for men who were 4 to 5 people who answered the end-line survey, felt like their voice was heard, like out of 0 to 10, approximately around 8. Women were slightly more. Native speakers felt that their voices were heard more than the non-native speakers. We'll come back to this discussion too a bit later. Next slide, please. And this is the leadership. So we look at the proportion of people who chose their roles from a list of roles as their leader of their group in the group discussions, and then like in the seminars as well. So men and women had the same proportion that they felt like in choosing that they're the leaders in their group roles. We didn't find any difference here. But native speakers more felt and hit the button that they're more likely to be the leaders of their groups in it. Yeah. So just to give the background information, we do have actually almost 18% of our students already a prior master's degree before coming to our master's degree. That's a large proportion, like at least we felt large in terms of our intake. And we will show that they actually do worse, those people who have an existing master's degree. It can be selection, it can be many other things. We don't know about why. It might be overconfidence. We don't, but we do have the average effect differences for those people who have the master's degree that are on average getting lower marks than the non-master's degree students. And then this is the scale that we asked them that how much you're exposed to, or quantitative and qualitative methods in your previous studies. And most of our students are exposed to something, but many of them said that qualitative, that they're more exposed to qualitative methods than quantitative methods in the department. Before coming to the department. And that's their response as well. Yeah. So you may ask the question, okay, so you're asking these interesting questions about how the group dynamics work for the outcomes of the students for the group's composition, and do people just stick with their group, and do they have interactions with the outside the group, with the outside their seminar groups? Should we really treat these as meaningful units of analysis? So we can say that like only 20% of the student body reported that they have studied or studied mostly, spent time with people outside their seminar or like peer study group. So majority of the students have actually said either sticked with their study group, like 42%, or they stick with the people in their seminar group, but not the study group. And then there's a quarter of them said like they didn't study with anyone else, they studied by themselves. So that's the so thank you. Next slide, please. So this is a last minute slide. I'm sorry for the formatting problems here that we see. We wanted to look at this language score that's constructed by these economists about how far one's own native tongue away from English. So they give scores versus Chinese, Arabic, Russian. So if there's added layers of alphabet being different as well. And then they have measures about the language origin constructions. And it's a scale between 0 to 3, but it's quite a continuous scale because we have many different languages in groups. So we end up like the higher the scale is, closer to English. Is that correct, Valentina?
Yes.
Yes, the higher the score is closer to English, the lower is further away from the English in terms of measurement. So we do have among the non-native speakers, so that's the mean score if it means anything, but then we do have some students who are, a quarter of the students who are like on the further end of the further away from the English speaking languages. Yeah. So I'm going to skip this section quite quickly because this is, oh, sorry. So I think that there's something wrong with the slide version that we did on Google Documents. So that's probably one of the reasons why I haven't shown the other thing. But I'll just quickly explain this. We run a linear and means model to estimate the causal impact of the proportion of women and the proportion of native speakers on various outcomes. These are the outcomes measured, and we are interested in these proportion of women and proportion of native speakers. These coefficients are our coefficients of interest, and we have a vector of control variables because by design that we argue that people's sorting into these groups are exogenous to the individuals, that we make the claim that like we estimate the causal effect of these compositions. And we take out the individual ego itself from the composition effect. So that's in addition to what the rest of the composition look like. And then in the second specification, we add seminar level variables, gender composition of the seminar, proportion of native speakers in the seminar. We also explore heterogeneous effects by running the regressions by group, men, women, native speakers, and non-native speakers. We run various regressions. Let me show the results quickly. We are going to show you a bunch of regression results from the specification that I just described. And about like our coefficient of interests are here. So we will have the main effects of being women and being a native English speaker. And then we have these proportion coefficients where we say, what is the effect of having proportion of native speakers in your group and then in your seminar separately in the model. Right? Yeah.
So is the proportion everybody except me, or
yeah.
You're part of the proportion?
You're not part of the proportion. Everybody except you. So like in the first one, we look at the actual exam marks and how they look like. What we find is, as we have guessed, once we include a set of controls, and we still find the native English so-called premium on the marks. Like native English speakers have on average higher marks than the others, almost 5% points higher than their counterparts. And we didn't find statistically significant effect of gender on grades, so we didn't find any men-women differences. But more women in the seminar group can increase in students' grades. So what we find that having more women in the seminar group has had a positive effect on everyone. Actually in that seminar group in their grades. So more slides. So we looked at the expected marks at the year end and expected marks at, just after being exposed to all the course, what they expect to get. We didn't find any significant effect on gender or native language on the expected mark at the end of the year, but more native speakers in the study group caused a decrease in the students' expectations of their marks, and this effect that we find is mostly driven by the non-native speakers. So next slide, please. So this is, we looked at, okay, is this true for those people who feel that they are like, their expected marks are affected for those people who are native speakers versus who are non-native speakers when you look at the composition of people in your group. So we find that it's basically, the effect was driven by for non-native speaker students, they have adjusted their expectations when there are more native speakers in their study group, and they're adjusted their expectations downwards.
Sorry, just to clarify something. Are you talking about the seminar group or the study group here?
So when we talk about the group, study group. When we talk about the seminar, I say seminar, usually. Yeah. So we have both levels in the estimation, by the way. So when we say the seminar here, seminar group, and then these are the group, I shouldn't use the group here. That's the term, yeah, seminars and the study groups are both in the same equation. And when we look at the native speakers, we find that for them, the women act in the same way. So you have more women in the seminar group causes an increase in the expected grades at the end of the course for whether they are men or women. So next slide, please. And we look at the voice heard. We find that the native English speakers feel like their voice is heard more on average once we control for all of these factors. And we find that women feel like their voice is heard more, in particular when there are more women in the group. And then we also find that non-native speakers feel more heard when there are more women in the group. So it gives a very clear indication that women listen. Sorry, as a man speaking here, it doesn't really look good. It's not lost on me. So next slide, please. So identifying as a leader. So we looked at who chose the leader as the group role. And we looked at the heterogeneous effects by men and women in the first column, the women sample and the man sample. I should say that we have a very few people responding online survey for men. So we do have some sort of statistical power issue over there. But we find that women are more likely to identify as a leader of their group when they are native English speakers. And in general, we find that men are more likely to identify as leaders when they're in teams with more women. So next, please. And now we ask questions, what is the likelihood that you're going to take a leadership role in your future career, in your future workplace, and so on. And like the only effect that we find is the men are more likely to declare that they will take a leadership position in the future, but if they are in teams where there are more women. So this is our general findings. I think next slide, please. So if I want to summarize in 2 dimensions, native speaker versus non-native speaker, basically find that native English speakers have significantly higher marks than non-native English speakers, even when controlled by other factors. And like we find that, I didn't show in detail, but further away one's own mother tongue to English, the higher the expected mark, and the larger the differences between expected and actual mark. So like the overshooting becomes much larger, and native English speakers feel like their voices heard more, and having more native English speakers in the study group causes a decrease in the students' expectations of their marks. However, it doesn't affect individuals' exam actual marks. So it happens in the expectations, but we don't see actual marks changes. And we find that this effect is driven by non-native speakers mostly. So they adjust their expectations once they are exposed to the non-native speakers. And we find that an increase in the percentage of native speakers in the group reduces their likelihood of any student reporting that they will be leading teams in the future. We don't show these results, but the last one is basically the people who have more native speaker in their groups have better guesses of their marks, period, in general. So it might be the information division or something else. We don't show these results, but they're better at guessing what their actual mark is going to be. Yeah. So when it comes to results about gender dimension, we talk about the clear patterns that emerge as well. So one of the patterns that emerges is that an increase in the proportion of women in the seminar group basically causes an increase in exam marks for everyone. So it's a female-dominated setting, which is great. And when there are more women in the group, women are more likely to report that they felt their voices were heard during group discussions as well. But we don't find the same effect for men, and men are more likely to state that they will be leading teams in the future when there are groups with more women. I'm repeating myself, and then the men in the minority feel more confident about their leadership. So having more women in the group also positively affects non-native speakers, and when non-native speakers also do report having more women, allows them to feel their voices were heard. So women are more likely to identify as a leader of their group when they are native English speakers. So it's the intersection of these two dimensions of diversity. Yeah. So what are our general and also the preliminary conclusions? It's very hard to wrap our head around. So we are still building these narratives. One of the things that we think it's important to pay attention how group work and team dynamics work in educational settings, but also a bit more on mature students because they have the imprint on the workplaces regarding language skills particularly and gender. And we think that this mature average age 25 students, postgraduate students with work experience shed light on the group dynamics where men are minority, gives us quite a unique setting to explore these questions. And we detect differential returns to language and somewhat to gender as well. And native speaker students doing on average better on all dimensions, even in a course that doesn't require particularly good writing skills because we have short answer exams, although we don't find too strong effects on more interactive factors on the exam results, but we do find very clear native student advantage on the exam results. Like maybe call for further investigation for why we do that and why there's a premium for native English speaker. Like it may be a host of variety of reasons that they might be better at reading like texts, they might be self-selected to the program differently and so on. But our hunch is that if in this course where we don't really test on the writing skills, we find these discrepancies, it's very likely that on assessments where we have the essay-based, these discrepancies might be even larger. So it's something to think about. And then finally, we didn't find in any of those estimations, men do seem to be suffer any negative consequences of being in whatever group that they are. So we didn't find any negative effects for men. That's also something interesting to reflect on. So if the group dynamics are only affecting like the composition of like women and the non-native speakers, and mostly. So that's something to think about for potential implications. Now, it's hard to come up with potential implications. As I started talking about this paper, is that we are not doing a paper that asks properly, or a design that we have that we can test whether group works work, or seminars work or don't work, or whether the course is working or not. Because this is not the design for answering those questions. This is a design about these like externalities of the group dimensions in a given unique setting. So then you may ask, okay, what do we learn about it? What can we do about it? We don't have evidence of whether any of these things will work. So we just throw out a bunch of ideas to think and reflect on it. And each of them will have pros and cons. Like, should we think about changing the evaluation methods towards less heavily relying on native English writing speaking? So one of the obvious things that we may discuss, it has advantages or disadvantages. We might be taken as a goal as a department that improve the writing skills of the people too, if that is something that we test on. We don't have any normative stance on any of these issues. We are just throwing up some implication ideas. And then also encouraging more non-native speaker students to speak up in seminars. Would it help that might be also cultural bias, that people within the non-native group may not be liking to be singled out or encouraged to be speaking up, or it may not be valued as much. Or highlight the stress, or highlight our stress during teaching that the exam is not strongly relying on English writing skills, because most of the effects that we find are on the expectations and self-confidence and leadership and so on. If that is the case, we might be building up the confidence, and by stressing that it's not that important to be writing slightly bad if you're not the first language speaker. Also, like more provocative ideas here, should we think about separate groups, or should we think about the higher language requirements in admitting the students? So these are some potential implications. All of them require different data sets and different proper evaluations. So we want to be very cautious about making them. So thank you. So all the difficult questions for Valentina, please.
Do you want me to
please
to moderate? I can't. Can people see now? Great.
They can see us, they can't see you unless you give ideas.
Sorry, I need to move.
You can see yourself.
I'll move the camera.
Okay, can I ask a
yeah.
So it's a difficult question. So here's a headline question for you. More is, should we, does this affect our application strategy? Okay, so from about, for example, the proportion of women that you might aim to enter. On the one hand, if maybe from a diversity point of view, should we, were we to take 50-50 as a baseline, we've got a higher proportion. So maybe it should come down. But on the other hand, you've seen that effectively headline result is that having more women have positive effects.
Yeah.
So
and we want to combine that, having more women have positive effects while having no negative effects for men.
Exactly. So I adding to your list of questions, there are even higher level questions.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
About application strategy in terms of who we might target at the margin.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. But that question requires also to investigate more clearly into our selection. We didn't do that.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Really interesting book. Lots of interesting stuff there. Comment and two questions, I think. But on first, I think I disagree that the assessment isn't a test of language skills, because although there's short answers, there's a lot of questions. It's timed. I think anything that's timed is going to put pressure on language skills. So I think this is language skills are much more important in this assessment than they are in an assessed essay, where the students can go away, they've got time, and so on. So I think I challenge kind of gaps interpretation maybe. So I would support, I think, changing the assessment to try it in a way that gets away from that. I think it would be one, specifically for 401 would be one way.
That's a great point. I mean, then the question is about the short time that makes them play out writing fast.
Yeah.
Or is it the essay type or actually elaborate essays? Because I'm not we don't test that. So I'm not.
I imagine both of those things are probably important. Yeah.
So if
writing 3-timed essays, I would think is also really a test or nods of a test for a non-native speaker. So I think our shift away towards these 1-week exams, towards more assessed essays, surely that must be getting rid of some some of the disadvantages that non-native speakers experience. I mean, for your exam,
Right.
obviously it's difficult to do that as in an assessed essay, giving people 2 weeks to do it. I can see why.
Yeah.
So
I'm curious about if the essay is a longer essay is also not testing the language skills. So because you will always give the word count, and succinctness is one of the dimensions and how much that you can explain, and that might be correlated with the language skills.
I would imagine students spend a lot. I mean, students, but I would imagine they end up spending much longer if they're non-native speakers.
Okay.
But they have the time. There's not that pressure.
Yeah.
So
that's a great implication. Maybe one implication of our result is for this course that we want to increase the time, and that might be a good test for seeing it. Yeah, that's a great point.
The question I want to ask one very small question and kind of. 2 questions. One is, when you look at the men's leadership result, which is fascinating, are you controlling, is that just what they said at the end, or is that kind of the change over time between what they said at the beginning? Do you see them changing their...
Valentina, the end result, like the leadership questions that we reported on the table were only on the end line survey. Is that right?
Yes.
So we did have also the measures for the baseline and end line that we could actually compare. But
I mean, it would be even stronger. It might not be enough change to pick something up. It would be even stronger to see them growing into their leadership role with all these women around.
Right. Great. I mean, I think that's something that we can do actually with the data that we didn't do, and in comparing. I think the baseline survey asked about previous experiences of teamwork in more detail, and we asked also about the roles that they choose, and we can compare.
See if they change their...
So all the change measures that we look at between baseline and end line suffers from some attrition issues, because end line survey has we have only 6% of the data, like all students, but they answer the end line surveys, unfortunately, so that we miss out the 40% and disproportionately men.
Right.
Can I say something too?
Yes, please.
The questions are different at the beginning, at the end though, because at the end, what we're asking is, within your group, what role did you have? It's a less general question at the beginning. They haven't had any interaction with their team, so we're asking them in a more general sense, what role do you usually take? But the question at the end is particularly to the dynamic of this setting, this study. So in your team, what role did you take? And then the other question it's in the future, and that's also more general. So in the future, what role do you think you're going to have in your group interactions?
Okay, and then my being a bit noise, but just ethnicity. What I think, are you going to plan to look at ethnicity as well, and how that interacts with this measure?
So we do have the country of origin. We don't have the ethnicity measure. So country of origin measure comes from the application files, and that's a poor proxy of ethnicity, but that's what we can use. Yeah.
So I'll come to Diana and then Tim, but can I just quickly say something, picking up on Kitty's point about English language? So I think we need to maybe separate out what goes on during the course from assessment, because of course it's not just what happens in the assessment, but how they comprehend, so comprehension during the course, which is not just about writing skills, but reading, comprehending lectures, and as you point out, participation in discussions. And then in terms of assessment, it's not just reading, but also comprehending questions. And as Kitty rightly points out, whether you're doing that under time conditions or not. So I think maybe there are a number of different issues that we could reflect on.
Exactly, that's an excellent point. Sorry. So it's not that, that's a great. Yeah.
So sorry, I was interrupting. Diana was next in terms of her question.
Yeah, thanks. It's sort of related to this, to the extent that for the group of non-native speakers, do you know how many of them have done previous degrees in the UK? Because I'm thinking whether the difference is just that they are non-native or because they're not used to this system. And I think also the question relates to previous master's degrees. Did they do the master's degree in the UK institution, or did they do them in another country where the system might be completely different? So they're not used to this system.
So Diana, thank you so much for the question. We actually have the data for it, but we needed to code UK, non-UK, yet we didn't get the chance to code it. But we have the previous degrees. We have the previous degrees specialization too, if they're coming from engineering versus languages. Or so we have that information, but we didn't get our hands around to code the data yet. So it's very likely that like familiarity with the system would be a factor. But the people who had the previous degrees and master's degrees already, they did perform worse on average. So that's also something interesting. So it may be because they have done an entire different field. It may be they have been overconfident about things and that they haven't prepared properly. There might be various other reasons that we don't know, but for people who do have the previous postgraduate degree and exposure, they're not necessarily doing the better. And then they might be also, a postgraduate degree is a compensation of a, like in the admission selection of some, like you get the stellar undergraduate students who are just finishing compared to someone whose undergrad was not great, but had a degree and then now wants to have another degree at a slightly bit higher ranked institution. So that might be one reason. So we don't know, to be honest, about what we can know. We do have the data.
Tim, I think.
Thanks, Isabel. Thanks for Kay and Valentina. That was really interesting. Dare I say it was fun. I mean, I think it's really, you have a captive audience because it relates to everything that we all do. So it's really good. So I wanted to kind of get you to sort of, try to pick your brains and be a bit interpretivist about some of the stuff that I found super fascinating. Because I think in the first summary findings slide, this idea that first of all, the further one's mother tongue was from English, the higher the expectation they had that, these are both about perception, right? Yeah. So misperception there, that they're overestimating their performance.
That's right.
And this idea that when they get surrounded by native English speakers, it's, oh no, I've completely misjudged myself.
That's right.
I'm going to be screwed over. Yeah. So can you kind of just, what's your thinking about what's behind these misperceptions? What's going on?
So I would like to ask that question to our students directly, which we have two here. But then one of the things is basically, as you said, so there's adjusting to like their better assessment of their skills once they're exposed to the other information. That's one channel. We do have potential mechanism slide, which I didn't show at the end because we don't test any of them. We don't have data to test what are the channels and mechanisms through which these effects are operating. But one of them is basically that adjustment happens by exposure by peer comparison. And then they have these group discussions that allow them the interaction to happen to say that, like, okay, I may not be understanding topics as best as I thought that I would be understanding. So that might be at play. But I think if you're asking the question about the intensity in terms of further away from the English language, the systems also differ. You're more likely to see people coming from a very, very different educational systems than the ones that are coming from the more English language. So, yeah, I think that leads.
I was just thinking two things. One, if you're a non-native speaker moving to the UK or and even the LSEs in elite university, you tend to also come from, say, universities in your home country, which are also elite or very good. So you might be performing really well back home. And when you make the transition, you assume you're going to perform as well in this new alien system that you don't really have exposure to. So that might lead to you thinking you're going to do better when you actually end up doing. And second, I also think SP401 is a very technical course. So you might know the technical language or the way to do it in your non-native language, but like translating it to English and like using and understanding technical terms in English is much harder for non-native speakers further away they are, which also might play.
So Hakan has a question and then Thomas.
Thank you. Fascinating research and presentation. Thank you for everyone involved. I think to a degree, Tim's question was getting to the question I wanted to sort of ask you whether you have explored or what ways it can be explored. What is it? I think the first summary slide you had, bullet point 2, bullet point 3, and bullet point 4 seem to have some interrelationship underlying. There's a certain mechanism there clearly, and that needs to be explored. And it's very difficult unless we understand dynamics mechanism leading to that kind of psychology. It's very difficult to have any conclusions in terms of what to do about seminars, I think, to my mind. Now, the second, or maybe the related issue, goes to how Kitty started. I think it's important to think about particularly the assessment for this course from the perspective of the students, whether they would consider this as a essay type, written type exam or not. I mean, we have a view on it, of course. It's not long essay, but it still involves number of things which are about language skills. That is reading comprehension, constructing and arguing and putting it on a paper very fast. And these are linguistic skills, independent of whether it's a long essay or not. And I think that's quite important to reverse our view to a little bit to the students. And then that brings me to the question of whether we look at some of these issues in the kind of rubric people are using elsewhere in terms of changing the language from attainment to awarding. I mean, if there is a premium on language, how far it's our problem as well as markers in this? What are we marking? What are we expecting? And whether our expectations are actually realistic. And then it's implicitly propagating kind of linguistic language skills premium. And the last one, I'm sorry, there's too many of these things, but such an interesting sort of conclusions and research. There are so many questions. This is just clarification, maybe two clarifications. One of them is reflection on my own experience. Is like I've been teaching in the department for 22 years in a number of these programs and courses. I never ever had a male man majority or single man seminar group. It has always been, I think, a broadly female majority, male, maybe one or sometimes none, and few. So I'm just curious how some of these findings in relation to men would be intramen in terms of different man groups coming from different language groups as well as different backgrounds. I mean, because I think there needs to be some kind of refinement of these categories, because not their experience might be different as well in relation to each other in terms of the sort of alpha males versus some other kinds, depending on language skills or backgrounds. And the last one is a clarification. When you mentioned initially native English speakers, and you listed some countries. I mean, is that were you using the shorthand, or that's the extent to which we consider native speakers?
No. So, just a clarification. Can I start by answering them from the clarification point? So,
yeah.
I just use it as a shorthand because we do ask the students whether they consider themselves as native speakers.
Yeah.
So we have the measure it's self-reported. We do have the data about their country of origin, the last residence country and the country of origin, which we didn't cross these two variables. So okay. I was just using it as a shortcut.
Yeah, because I think it just excluded a whole countries, including India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc.
So
I mean, there's a whole
I'm sure that we have a lot of students who identify themselves as native speakers coming from all sorts of countries where the majority of the language is not English either.
Okay.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've seen in the data, and most of them are from the UK, USA, and Australia. That's true, but there are students from other countries that identify as native English speakers.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much for the other points. I think that the point well taken about how to think about this course in terms of assessment and language skills, and I take on board what Isabel also said. Language skills play out throughout the course, and then like we see the end results with an assessment type. And I agree the point that under time pressure might actually give the native speakers a bit of an advantage in the assessment as well. But I'm not sure about constructing arguments as one of the assessment type. Like the short answers did not require a lot of construction of arguments, but actually testing.
Well, you need to answer. You need to bring your thoughts out of comprehension into an answer, and some of those answers required that kind of construction. I mean, that might have a different. It's still language skill in a different way.
Yeah, point well taken. I think that we need to think more about how much the course actually requires, or what advantage that native speakers have throughout the course that is reflected on the assessed marks. I mean, I think that's something that we need to think more about it. I'm sorry, I might have missed some of those points because I wasn't taking notes. Can you remind me?
The first one was actually the relationship between the 3 bullet points. Whether is it possible to actually do either whether you have data to do it within this particular research, or do you think there needs to be a different kind of research to assess the mechanism?
That's right. So
through those 2, 3, 4, because there is a clear mechanism there.
Yeah, you're right. So our results give us an indication of a potential mechanism, but to be testing it, we need a different kind of research properly. So that's true. So when we triangulate all of these results, when they come together, that we kind of see where it's going, but we don't properly test them. So it's and one of the things that you raised about thinking about men, because we have such a small sample of, like, especially in the expectation survey for men, doing anything quantitatively is very hard on them, like for further exploring mechanisms. We just run out of power. Maybe a different research strategy needs it. So have qualitative research might be very helpful in that case, maybe hearing about the mechanisms more. Yeah.
Thomas.
Thanks, Berkay, for the talk. Thanks to all of you for putting it together. Minor questions. Tell me if I missed this, but at least I would encourage you to also look if your results hold up if you split the sample into 2 years.
Yeah.
Because I think that there were some differences in the overall course structure, but mostly just how the seminars were taught. There was a lot of difference. Most important, maybe that doesn't really affect your findings for the study groups, because these were pretty similar, but the seminar group level one, because last year we had 8 people seminar groups.
Yeah.
And so compositional things might play out quite differently. And I'm especially thinking about this, having more women. You know, I wonder if in a group of 16 having 14 or 15 women.
That's right.
Makes a big difference, but if it's in a group of 8, if it's 6 or 7, that maybe is much more close. So maybe that result is driven by the last year. And similarly, although it was only a few groups, I would also look if these online groups, when you exclude them, because I think there were, at least, you know, like, because I taught a lot of them, it seemed to me, even though I wasn't in the allocation process involved, but I think there was something non-random.
So
which was that,
I can track that.
Who got in online anyway, but then also in which groups they were, because it seemed about at which time of day are you awake.
Yeah.
Right, because I had in the evening I had people from Latin America, and in the morning I had Chinese people. Yeah, or from Asia generally, and so there was something.
Yeah. So Thomas, thank you so much. You nailed the 2 issues that we discussed this morning. Valentina and I have at length. So they were right to spot on. One of the things is basically, I asked Valentina and she asked me, and we discussed among ourselves whether size matters. We don't know that, because we do find general patterns replicated in the smaller group and in the seminar group in the pooled data. And you're right that if the second year's cohort seminar sizes have expanded more, are we going to see the same patterns also in the even larger sizes? I think that's something that we need to further explore. And we discussed that already among ourselves. So like the coefficient signs were similar directions in the smaller group versus the larger group. And we do have the clustered standard errors at the larger group that we lose more. And so, like, it's this number of seminars then like shrink as a unit of analysis. So we do have those issues as well. But I think that's a fair point. Like, that's also a point that has implications about smaller, how small, how large, and it's a substantively important point. The second thing is basically about those online groups and then allocation to it. You're right. We do have few number of students have changed and switched to online, and then they requested those changes, which we were able to trace them. And then we have been reassured, at least in the first year when you were thinking by Craig, that they were not given options. They were given, like, because of a lot of course clashes, and Chris Kennedy and I have been emailing back and forth back then about how many of them that we should be approving. And I was very worried about both the experiment, but I was also worried about students' well-being. So we allow people to do those changes like as much as possible. But Craig was assuring me that there were only 1 or 2 options that the students could join in terms of if they want to stay whole term online. And we argued that those options were exogenous to the peer group composition. At least, well, they might be in the same region of the world. So maybe the native speaker language composition might be more affected by it. But we do think that they didn't know who else were in that group once they while they were choosing it into that group. So it's not we may still need to take them out, those 3-4 groups, and then run the estimations again and then see whether results hold.
Okay.
But I think I agree with that would be an easier robustness check that we can do. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Yes. Yeah.
Grace.
Yes, thank you, Berkay and Valentina, for the presentation. Super interesting. I've just got a couple of questions more because I'm just curious about the data. I know you said only 20% of the students sort of spend time with each other that's not within their group or something like that, as in they all mix with each other. And I wondered if you knew what the composition of those people look like, whether it's more females that are going out to meet each other, well, not going out, but meeting each other outside their group, or because I thought that would be an interesting insight into seeing how they interact with their group. Also matters how they interact with others. And that makes them probably maybe more confident or less confident within their groups. I also wondered how you dealt with, I think we've talked a lot about this, but what of people who are fluent, well, native English speakers, but also native other language, sort of dual speakers? I'm not sure if that's something you capture in the data or how they're treated. I'm assuming they go into the native speaker group the moment they say that they're native speaking. And finally, I wondered if, I don't know how long the master's course is, it a year? I was wondering if that's a sort of short time period. So you're sort of estimating the sort of lower bound effect, I guess, in some way. Because I'm thinking of my personal experience, I guess. I think I speak pretty good English, but when I started in my undergraduate, the cultural differences made it really difficult to speak out. But within the second year, I felt like I adapted pretty well. So I think there's also a time effect of, even though you can speak the language, you're not immediately confident, but then you adapt and then that expectations change. But yeah, those are my questions. Thank you.
So Chiara and Valentina may chip in on these answers, but these are great questions. Native speakers are those who say that we are native speakers. So we don't know beyond that. But also about the short time span, which is true that the students are exposed at short 10 weeks. And that's where our treatment happens. And it has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that you have isolated the people who have just arrived and over a period of 10 weeks time before interactions and options and other combinations and preferences play out. So we have in that sense, we have a cleaner sample to look at in the first term. But on the other hand, it's a short, light touch treatment because the group work doesn't have an assess component. Incentives are there if they want to participate and do these things, but they're not direct mark incentives assigned to these speaking up in the group, speaking up in the seminars or anything. So it's just with a low stakes treatment in that sense. So you're right, in a shorter period, low stakes treatment, and this is the setting that we have. Yeah.
Can I add something regarding the interaction outside the peer group? So it's not, the question wasn't about if you interact with people outside the seminar, if you're outgoing. It's more did you work, the work that you were supposed to do with your group? Did you only did it with your group? Did you only study with your group, or did you study with other people? Because what we wanted to measure was how intense was the teamwork, And what we found was that only 20% ever studied with someone from outside their group. So what this tells us is that we are analyzing the relevant peer groups. So more than 80% of the students were only studying with people either in their seminar group or in their study group during the whole term. So that makes the analysis that we're carrying is in the relevant peer group. I also think that it's important. It's true that this is a one-year master, but international students come for the master and then they leave. So if there are things that are changing here, like their perception of if they're going to be leaders in the future, that's the interaction that they got here, and that they are living with this experience that we had. They don't, most of them are not going to have the chance to change their perception of how they are in an international environment.
Great, thank you. That's clear.
Yeah, also, like, if I can say, so these are mature students, right? And that also have work experience and a lot of, international interaction now that is even more prevalent with, like after COVID, where everybody starts interacting internationally. Like, since, they're working every single time they meet on a task that is, potentially, they discuss on something that they need to get done, really like mimic some of international teamwork, and can give a sense also on potentially a sort of linguistic disadvantage in the workplace, where I don't know, in international organizational settings, for instance, or even office settings, like the size of the team is really similar to what will happen, I don't know, in our international consulting projects, for example. The length of the course is also during a semester time. That's a typical, the time frame that the course has is, a typical consulting international project like. So I mean, I guess, it's something that goes beyond, we think, given the setting and the age of the people and the situation that happened during COVID, where this type of work international is going to be probably more and more prevalent. I mean, it gives some food for thought for those settings as well, we think.
Okay, we've got 3 more questions, and then I think we've run out of time. Clearly, this is a really hot topic, Berkay, so I'm very pleased that we've had your presentation.
Can we check that every wire is plugged in to make sure the sound is okay?
We're asking for the PC to be swapped out.
Thank you.
So we've got Michaela, and then Johan, and then Eva. So Michaela.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm not on my camera. I just don't have a good connection. Valentina, Berkay, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I'm thinking about one thing, and I'm not sure whether I missed it because of the connection. I'm not sure whether Berkay said this. Do you have information on the age of the students? And it was control for, I guess, then.
No, we didn't control for age. We do have the information. We have the average age 25, but I don't think in the equation that we included them in the estimations, the age variation. We do have a variation of like approximately 10, 12 years in the age cohorts, and that might be something important to take into account. So thank you, Ella. Yeah.
Johan?
Thank you. Berkay, I suspect I'm going to regret posing this question. But yeah, do you have you observed, or do you intend to look at the variation according to the seminar instructors?
So we do have seminar instructor fixed effects. So we net out your differences. So in our estimations, yes, we do have this like seminar instructors in the equation. But also we do have, we use like not only as a fixed effects, but we also look at the gender of the seminar instructors. Does it really play out in terms of fostering the discussion in a different way?
Can I have to check the supplementary material?
Yeah, the unpublished supplementary materials. Yeah.
And we do have also the markers. So yeah.
Eva?
Actually, it's a related question. Whether you find any effects for teachers' characteristics, especially, for example, for this outcome of leadership. Say, if you have a non-native teacher, does that improve your leadership?
So Valentina, I can't recall, like she ran gazillions of regressions recently. So
yeah, we controlled for it. So we looked for effects of seminar leader native language, seminar leader gender, the academic advisor gender, academic advisor native language. We don't find any statistically significant effects.
And can I just, the other question, I don't know if you mentioned this, is whether you could repeat the analysis for the other compulsory course, SP400. different, less technical, also with a different type of assessment, at least to see, for example, effects for observed marks.
Yeah, that sounds great. If the cohort coordinators are up to it, we are not up to it for it. So
Me too. I'm up for it.
It sounds exciting. So we can do it. It's low cost. Yeah. I'll talk to Sonia.
So we would, back of the room, we were suggesting that the academic rank of the instructor might be.
Oh, that's a very good point.
Rather than, or in addition to those other things, if there is a built-in cultural deference, for example.
That's right. That's an excellent point.
People will not.
Can we take it, please?
Great. Okay, well, thanks so much, Berkay and Valentina, for presenting some really interesting results. Of course, lots for us to continue to think about in terms of our diversity of assessment, teaching planning, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Valentina, for everything.